Case 1. Lori Vallow Daybell. The Doomsday, MOM. There are criminal cases that shock a community. There are cases that shock a state. And then there are cases so vast, so deeply bizarre, and so utterly heartbreaking that they shake the entire nation to its foundation. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell is that kind of case. It is a story that has everything: apocalyptic religious beliefs, secret marriages, bodies buried in shallow graves, a trail of death stretching across multiple states, and at its center, a woman who looked, on the surface, like a perfectly ordinary American mother. Lori Vallow was born in Louisiana and raised in a household that, by most accounts, appeared normal. She was known as charismatic, attractive, and deeply religious, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She had been married multiple times before and had children from prior relationships. Her two youngest children were 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua Vallow, who went by JJ. JJ had been adopted by Lori and her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, and he was autistic, a sweet, energetic little boy described by those who knew him as full of life. In 2018, something began to shift. Lori became deeply entangled with a man named Chad Daybell, an Idaho author who wrote religious fiction centered on prophecies, the end of the world, and what he described as the ability to detect whether human beings had been overtaken by dark or evil spirits. In the fringe theology that Chad and Lori developed together, they believed themselves to be literally divine figures. Chad called himself James. Lori called herself Elena. And they believed they had the power to assess the spiritual status of anyone around them, labeling people either as beings of light or beings of darkness, which they called zombies. This is where the horror begins. Because in this belief system, once someone was labeled a zombie, a person whose body had been taken over by an evil spirit, that person was, in the twisted theology of Chad and Lori, no longer really a person at all. And the people they began to label as zombies were not strangers. They were family members. They were people who stood between Lori and the life she wanted to live with Chad Daybell. Charles Vallow, her husband at the time, was the first to go. Charles had become increasingly alarmed by Lori's radicalization. He had sought legal intervention, attempting to have Lori committed for psychiatric evaluation. He had pleaded with family members. He wanted to protect JJ and the other children. And according to prosecutors, this made him a threat that Lori and her brother, Alex Cox, decided to eliminate. On July 2, 2019, Charles Vallow was shot and killed inside Lori's home in Chandler, Arizona. Alex Cox claimed self-defense, saying Charles had attacked him with a baseball bat. The story was suspicious from the beginning. Investigators noted that Alex and Lori waited more than 40 minutes before calling 911. Charles's family immediately knew something was wrong. But Alex Cox was not charged, and Lori walked free. What came next was a cascade of death. Weeks after Charles was murdered, Lori and Chad's relationship accelerated dramatically. Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife of 29 years, died suddenly in October of 2019 at the age of 49. Her death was initially attributed to natural causes, but it was later determined she had been suffocated. She died just days after Lori and Chad had discussed her in the context of their dark spiritual belief system. Within weeks of Tammy's death, Chad and Lori were married, on a Hawaiian beach, with their children's bodies already in the ground. Because by then, Tylee and JJ were gone. They had last been seen in September of 2019. When relatives reached out to check on them, Lori told different people different stories. They were with a family friend, they were in Arizona, they were fine. Police did a welfare check at the family's Rexburg, Idaho home. The children were not there. Lori and Chad claimed they were fine. The children were not fine. For months, the search went on. The nation watched as authorities pressed Lori for answers she refused to give. She fled to Hawaii. She gave interviews on the beach, smiling, while her children's whereabouts remained unknown. She hired attorneys. She evaded extradition. And through it all, she maintained that her children were safe. In June of 2020, investigators searched Chad Daybell's rural Idaho property. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. JJ Vallow, 7 years old, had been buried in a pet cemetery on the grounds, his small body wrapped in plastic bags and duct tape. Tylee Ryan, 16 years old, had been dismembered and her remains burned in a fire pit nearby. The burns were so severe that it took extensive forensic work to identify her. The nation wept, and then it demanded answers. Lori Vallow Daybell was ultimately tried in Idaho in 2023, facing charges of first-degree murder in the deaths of Tylee and JJ, and conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell. The trial laid bare the full scope of the couple's depraved belief system. Witnesses testified that Lori had referred to Tylee as a zombie. Testimony confirmed that Lori had labeled JJ the same way. She had, in effect, determined that her own children were no longer worthy of life, not because they had done anything wrong, but because their existence had become an inconvenience to her new apocalyptic romance. A jury found her guilty on all counts in May of 2023. At sentencing, Judge Stephen Boyce did not mince words. He looked at Lori Vallow Daybell and told her she had chosen the most evil and destructive path possible. He told her she had justified her actions by going down a bizarre religious rabbit hole, and he sentenced her to multiple consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. But that was not the end. Arizona was waiting, because Lori Vallow Daybell had not only conspired to kill her children and her husband's former wife. She had also conspired, with her brother Alex Cox, to murder Charles Vallow in Arizona. And she had conspired in an attempted murder against Brandon Boudreaux, her niece's former husband, who had survived a drive-by shooting in the Phoenix suburb of Gilbert in October of 2019. Boudreaux had grown suspicious of Lori and Alex in the aftermath of Charles's death, and prosecutors argued that Lori had moved to silence him as well. A Jeep registered to a family member fired a rifle at Boudreaux outside his home, but the shot missed. Lori represented herself in both Arizona trials, which were held separately in the spring of 2025. In each case, she gave dramatic opening statements, declared her innocence, and called no witnesses. She was found guilty in both. At her Arizona sentencing on July 25, 2025, Judge Justin Boreski told her she had shown blatant disregard for humanity and had left a wake of destruction stretching across multiple states. He sentenced her to 2 additional life terms, 25 years to life for each Arizona conviction, to be served consecutively to her Idaho sentences. Lori Vallow Daybell now carries 7 life sentences. She will die in prison. Her surviving son, Colby Ryan, testified at her sentencing. He said that after everything that had happened, the murder of his stepfather Charles, the disappearance and death of his siblings, his mother's conviction, he was left standing alone. He looked at his mother in the courtroom and said, "I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy." Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow never made it out of 2019. They were supposed to have a whole lifetime ahead of them. Instead, they have justice, incomplete, insufficient, but real. And their mother will spend every remaining day of her life behind bars, fading, as the judge told her, into obscurity. If this case moved you, if you believe these children deserve justice and that stories like theirs should never be forgotten, please hit the like button right now, drop a comment below telling us your thoughts, and make sure you have subscribed to Cold Case Revisited. Your support keeps these stories alive. Let's continue. Case 2. Rachel Henry. 3 children, 1 night. January 20th, 2020 began as an ordinary Monday for the residents of a quiet Phoenix neighborhood near 24th Street and Baseline Road. By nightfall, it had become a crime scene that would haunt the officers who responded to it for the rest of their careers. Rachel Henry was 22 years old at the time. She was a young mother living with her aunt and the father of her children. She had 3 kids, all of them toddlers and infants. 3-year-old Zane Henry, 23-month-old Maria Henry, and 7-month-old Catalea Rios, still in the earliest months of her life. At approximately 11 that night, it was not Rachel who called for help. It was her great-aunt, the woman who lived in the home, who dialed 911. When police and emergency responders arrived, they found 3 small children on a couch. They were arranged as though sleeping. They were not sleeping. They were dead. Rachel Henry met officers at the scene and behaved, at first, like a woman in shock. Body camera footage captured her crying and telling officers she had put the children down for a nap and thought they were sleeping. She said she had no idea what had happened. She said she was going to get a job so she could get her own place so the babies would be fine. But the story did not hold up. Investigators began to piece together what had actually occurred. According to court documents and admissions that Rachel made to detectives, the events of that evening were deliberate, sequential, and methodical in their horror. Rachel Henry had suffocated her children one by one. She started with Maria, her 23-month-old daughter. While the two of them were playing, Rachel placed her hand over Maria's mouth and held it there until the little girl stopped breathing. 3-year-old Zane witnessed what was happening to his sister. According to prosecutors, he tried to stop his mother, hitting her and yelling at her, doing what any terrified 3-year-old would do when confronted with something too large for his small mind to process. Rachel tried to grab him, but was interrupted when the children's father and great-aunt arrived home unexpectedly. She waited, and then, once she had another opportunity, she took 3-year-old Zane to a bedroom, sang him a lullaby, and suffocated him as he fought back against her. Then she returned to 7-month-old Callejas. She gave the baby a bottle and waited for her to fall asleep. When Callejas drifted off, Rachel placed her hand over the infant's face until she stopped breathing entirely. After each killing, she arranged the children on the couch, side by side, as though they were napping peacefully. She wanted them to look like they were sleeping. A relative later set up a video call with Rachel and asked her why she did it. Rachel's response was haunting. She said she felt like she was losing her mind. She said she didn't understand why everyone was acting the way they were. She offered no explanation that made sense, because there is none. There is no version of this story in which 3 babies deserved what happened to them. Witnesses told police that Rachel had a methamphetamine addiction and had been acting strangely in the days before the killings. The family had recently relocated to Arizona from Oklahoma. Her defense team would later argue that factors like postpartum depression, an alcohol disorder, a difficult social history, and a lack of support all played roles in her state of mind. They acknowledged that even Rachel herself could not fully explain what she had done. None of it brought back Zane, Maria, or Callejas. The legal process that followed Rachel Henry's arrest was long and grinding. She initially pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. For nearly 5 years, the case wound through the courts, delayed again and again. It was not until December of 2024, almost 5 years after the night of the murders, that Rachel Henry changed her plea to guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, accepting the deal that took the death penalty off the table. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 2025, Rachel Henry, now 27 years old, appeared in Maricopa County Superior Court before Judge Jeffrey Fish. She wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles around her ankles. When given the opportunity to speak, she said nothing. Judge Fish sentenced her to 3 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, 1 for each child. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office confirmed that Rachel Henry will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell said afterward that it was hard to comprehend how any parent could take the life of their own child, and that the prosecution team had ensured justice was served for 3 innocent children. Zane Henry was 3 years old. He saw what was happening and tried to stop it. 3-year-old Maria was 23 months. Callejas Rios was 7 months old, barely old enough to recognize the face that looked down at her in her final moments. They deserved so much more than what they got. If you're watching this and you believe these babies deserve to be remembered, please hit the like button, leave a comment for them, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. We never let a child's story go untold. Case 3. Inoue, the Cleaver in the Dark. On the night of May 15, 2021, police officers were called to an apartment near Mill and Southern Avenues in Tempe, Arizona, following a domestic disturbance. There had been an argument between a husband and wife. The wife had used a meat cleaver to destroy her husband's computer and other electronics. Officers arrived, assessed the situation, noted that the 2 children in the home, a 9-year-old girl named Mia and a 7-year-old boy named Kai, appeared to be asleep. The officers left. The children were alive. Hours later, Inoue walked into a Tempe Police Department substation. She told an officer that she had heard voices telling her to kill her children. She said she had gone to bed with her kids and woken up to find blood. Police raced back to the apartment. When they arrived, they found Mia and Kai Inoue dead. What they found at the scene was almost beyond description. Both children had sustained extensive injuries to their heads and necks. They had been covered with trash, boxes, and a mattress. The number of injuries each child had suffered was described by prosecutors as too many to count. Medical examiners would later determine that the force of the blows was comparable to that of a guillotine. The murder weapon, a blood-soaked meat cleaver, was recovered in the car Inoue had driven to the police station. Inoue was 9 years old. Inoue was 7. They had been asleep in their beds when their mother came into their room. The investigation that followed revealed a marriage that had been disintegrating for months. Inoue and her husband had filed for divorce just 1 month before the killings, though they were still sharing the apartment. There had been prior incidents. In March of 2021, Inoue had allegedly disappeared with Kai, prompting a report to the Arizona Department of Child Safety. Police located her behind a convenience store and took her to a psychiatric hospital. When they checked on the children at that time, investigators found no visible signs of abuse or neglect. The DCS investigation was still open when Mia and Kai were killed. Prosecutors argued at trial that Inoue murdered her children not out of psychotic break, but out of calculated rage, specifically, rage directed at her husband over money and their impending divorce. She had been fighting for financial support. She had been planning to return to Japan. Prosecutors painted the picture of a woman who, consumed by bitterness and fury, chose to destroy the very people her husband loved most, to take from him what could never be replaced. The defense argued that there was not enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Inoue had committed the murders. They pointed to the fact that no one had seen the crime happen and that no neighbors had heard anything. They argued that the medical examiner's description of the force required to inflict such injuries was inconsistent with Inoue's small physical stature. Defense attorney Rebecca Felmley told the jury that her client simply did not have the power or the strength to cause that type of injury to those kids. The jury rejected the defense's argument. They deliberated for a short time before returning a verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and 1 count of disorderly conduct. Inoue was not present in the courtroom for her own verdict. She had waived her right to be there and learned of the decision from her jail cell. But at sentencing, she was required to appear, and what she said when she addressed the court was as chilling as anything in the case itself. Through a Japanese translator, Inoue told the court that her children were not dead. She said her parents had them. She said they were spending their time with her parents. Mia and Kai's former school principal, Tammy Feet, stood before the court and read her victim impact statement with her voice breaking. She described how their absence from the school community had been felt every day since their deaths. She said she missed their warm smiles, their gentle spirits, and their infectious giggles. She said that although they were both children, she wanted the court to know their short lives mattered. Judge Jeffrey Reuter said he was nearly speechless. He told the court that words could not adequately describe what had occurred, that he could not imagine what those children went through in their last minutes. The fear, the pain, the suffering. He called it incomprehensible. And then he sentenced Inoue to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murders, plus an additional 35 years in prison for the child abuse and disorderly conduct convictions, all to be served consecutively. She will never be released. She will never see Japan again. She will never walk out of a prison door. Mia and Kai Inoue were sleeping soundly when the Cleaver came in the dark. They deserved every morning after that one, every laugh, every school year, every hug. They deserved everything. If you believe their story should be told and their memory honored, please like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. We are fighting for truth, one story at a time. Case 4. Sammantha Allen, The Box in the Heat. There are crimes so layered in systematic cruelty that they cease to feel like isolated incidents and begin to feel like something else entirely, like a sustained, coordinated campaign of torture waged against a child who had no means of escape, no advocate, and no hope. The story of Aim Deal is one of those cases. Aim Deal was born in the late 1990s and grew up in a household that functioned as a kind of private cruelty machine. Her mother had left the family years before, driven away by abuse, and moved to Kansas without taking aim. The girl was left behind, shuffled between relatives, and eventually ended up in a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in South Phoenix where at least 10 adults and children lived together. The home was headed, in effect, by her grandmother Judith Deal, her aunt Cynthia Stoltzmann, and Stoltzmann's daughter Sammantha Allen and Sammantha's husband John Allen. Deal was treated differently from the other children in the house. Investigators would later describe the treatment she received as a level of cruelty that was targeted, calculated, and specific to her. While the other children lived relatively normal lives, was subjected to a regime of punishment and humiliation that defies easy description. She was beaten with a wooden paddle. She was kicked in the face. She was forced to eat dog feces. She was made to crush aluminum cans barefoot on the garage floor. She was dunked into a cold swimming pool and held under. She was forced to consume hot sauce in quantities that made her physically ill, and she had been forced into the plastic box before. Multiple times. It was a Foot-Locker-style storage container, less than 3 feet long, less than 1 foot wide, and about a foot deep. Stood approximately 4 feet tall and weighed nearly 60 pounds. To get her inside it, her body had to be contorted, compressed, folded into itself. The box had only small holes near the handles for air circulation. On the night of July 11, 2011, Deal had stolen a popsicle from the freezer. That was the infraction. A popsicle, something any child might have reached for on a hot summer night in Arizona, where the temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees. The punishment was the box. Sammantha Allen and her husband John Allen locked inside the plastic storage container and went to bed. They fell asleep. The desert summer night was hot. The room was not air-conditioned. And Deal was trapped, folded inside a container no bigger than a dog crate, in the rising heat. When John and Sammantha Allen woke the next morning, they opened the box and found dead. Her lips were discolored. She had died from asphyxiation, suffocated by the lack of oxygen in the sealed container. Their initial story to police was that must have climbed into the box while playing hide-and-seek. But other family members quickly contacted authorities and told the truth. They had seen placed in the box before. They had seen the beatings, the punishments, the cruelty that had been normalized in that home over a period of years. Child welfare authorities in Arizona said they had not received reports of abuse before Ames' death. Police later discovered that in Utah, where the family had previously lived, Deal was already listed as an abused child by Child Protective Services. She had been on the radar. She had been identified as at risk. And she had still ended up in that box. Sammantha Allen was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and 4 counts of child abuse. Her trial in 2017 lasted approximately 2 weeks. The jury heard testimony about the full scope of Ames' abuse history. They were shown photographs that reduced jurors to tears. They heard from witnesses who described the casual, almost bureaucratic cruelty that had defined Ames' daily existence in that home. In June of 2017, Sammantha Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and 4 counts of child abuse. In August, the jury sentenced her to death. She became one of the very few women on Arizona's death row and, along with her husband John, who was also convicted and sentenced to death, the first member of a married couple to receive the death penalty in Arizona history. The Arizona Supreme Court, in 2022, upheld Sammantha Allen's murder conviction and death sentence, rejecting her claims that the trial had been fundamentally flawed. The justices wrote that to characterize Sammantha's actions as mere presence or a simple failure to render aid mischaracterized the facts. They found that her failure to release from the container was what killed the child. Sammantha Allen remains on Arizona's death row. She was 34 years old as of the court's 2022 ruling. The appeals process continues, as it does with every capital case, but the Arizona Supreme Court has already spoken. She was there when was put in the box. She participated, and she went asleep. Deal was found just 2 weeks before her 11th birthday. She had lived her whole life in a household that saw her as a burden, a nuisance, a thief of popsicles, a child who was punished and punished and punished until there was no more of her left to punish. If Deal's story made you feel something, if it enraged you, broke your heart, or made you want to fight for children who cannot fight for themselves, hit that like button, subscribe to Cold Case Revisited, and share this video. These children are counting on us to keep their stories alive. Case 5. Cynthia Stoltzmann, the guardian who failed. While Sammantha Allen wielded the power in the Allen household, there was another woman in that house of horrors who held a title that made her betrayal of Deal even more devastating: her legal guardian. Cynthia Stoltzmann was Deal's aunt. More than that, she was the adult the legal system had designated as responsible for Ames' care and safety. She was supposed to be the person who stood between aim and harm. Instead, she was one of the architects of the world that killed her. Stoltzmann was Sammantha Allen's mother, which made her both Aim's aunt and caretaker and the mother of the woman who would ultimately be convicted of Aim's murder. The generational nature of the dysfunction in that household is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. The cruelty that Sammantha Allen participated in did not develop in a vacuum. It was normalized, taught, and practiced in a family system that had placed no value on Aim Deal's life for years. Cynthia Stoltzmann was charged with criminal offenses related to Aim's death and the pattern of sustained abuse that preceded it. The evidence against her was significant. Witnesses placed her in the home during incidents of abuse. The prosecution established that she had known about the punishments being inflicted on Aim: the beatings, the dunking, the forced eating of dog feces, the use of the box, and had done nothing to stop them. She had been the child's designated guardian, and she had allowed the horror to continue. Stoltzmann did not face a murder charge, but she faced serious criminal accountability for her role in the abuse that defined Aim's life. She accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 24 years in prison for child abuse. Under Arizona sentencing guidelines, this was a significant sentence reflecting the serious nature of her complicity. In court records and subsequent reporting, what emerged was a portrait of a household in which the abuse of Aim Deal had become so routine, so normalized, that the adults around her had stopped seeing it as abuse at all. It had become the wallpaper of daily life. Aim was the family's punching bag, literally, in some instances, and the adults who should have protected her had become complicit in her degradation. What makes Cynthia Stoltzmann's case particularly tragic is the question it raises about how any guardian can watch a child in her care be subjected to the kind of treatment Aim Deal endured and do nothing. The answer, painful as it is, speaks to the way abuse becomes normalized in certain family systems, how it is passed down, accepted, rationalized, and ultimately embraced as a form of control and order. Aim Deal had a legal guardian. She had an aunt who was supposed to look after her. And in the end, that guardian did not look after her at all. She looked the other way. Cynthia Stoltzmann is serving her 24-year sentence. She will have served her time long before Aim Deal would have graduated from high school, gotten her first job, or had a family of her own. The disproportion of those facts is something that cannot be easily reconciled. Aim Deal had no one truly fighting for her while she was alive. She has the justice system fighting for her now. It is too late to save her. But it is never too late to remember her. If you are still watching, please give this video a like, leave a comment remembering Aim, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited for more stories that matter. Case 6. Denise Janelle Snow-Ingram. The Invisible Child. In a nation with mandatory vaccination schedules, regular pediatric checkups, and widespread public health infrastructure, it is almost incomprehensible that a 16-month-old child could die of starvation in the 21st century without anyone noticing until she was already gone. And yet that is precisely what happened to baby Miriam Ingram in Phoenix, Arizona, in the summer of 2013. Miriam was 16 months old. At the age of 16 months, a typically developing child should weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 24 pounds. They should be beginning to walk, beginning to talk, beginning to explore the world with that fearless, joyful, insatiable curiosity that defines early toddlerhood. Miriam Ingram weighed less than 9 pounds. That is the weight of a newborn, a small one. It is the weight of a baby who has barely entered the world, not one who has been alive for 16 months. And the reason Miriam weighed less than 9 pounds was not a medical mystery. It was not a congenital condition. It was not an illness beyond anyone's control. It was the result of a deliberate pattern of deprivation and neglect at the hands of the woman who was supposed to feed her, clothe her, hold her, and love her, her mother, Denise Janelle Snow-Ingram. On July 10, 2013, Snow-Ingram called 911 to report that her daughter was unresponsive. Emergency responders transported Miriam to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. The medical examination that followed revealed the full scope of what had been done, or rather, what had not been done, for this child. Miriam was suffering not only from severe malnutrition but from rickets, a disease caused by a deficiency of vitamin D, typically resulting from lack of exposure to sunlight and inadequate nutrition. To develop rickets to the degree that Miriam had, A child must have been deprived of basic care over a sustained period of time. The disease causes bones to weaken and deform. It causes pain. It causes developmental delay. It is a condition that, in a child with access to proper nutrition and medical care, simply does not occur. Prosecutors established at trial that Snow-Ingram had fed Miriam a diet consisting almost entirely of oatmeal, watered-down apple juice, and small amounts of fruit. Once Miriam was no longer being breastfed, she received virtually no protein and no calcium. She received nothing that a growing child's body requires to survive. And she received no medical care, because, Snow-Ingram told police, the family did not believe in taking children to doctors. Their religious beliefs, she said, precluded medical intervention. 7 physicians testified at Snow-Ingram's trial. All of them agreed that rickets of the severity Miriam had developed was almost always the result of both insufficient sunlight exposure and an inadequate diet. The prosecution argued that Snow-Ingram had intentionally deprived Miriam of food and medical care over a period of many months, that this was not an accident, not an ignorance of nutritional science, but a willful failure to provide for a child who was visibly wasting away. The facts of the case also revealed something troubling about how the system had responded to Miriam before her death. The Arizona Department of Child Safety had been in contact with the Snow-Ingram family at the time of Miriam's birth, noting concerns that a newborn in the household would not receive necessary follow-up care. DCS had conducted an investigation and ultimately determined that the children in the home were safe. They closed the case. Months later, Miriam was dead. Denise Janelle Snow-Ingram was not prosecuted immediately. The wheels of justice moved slowly in this case. It was not until 2023, a full decade after Miriam's death, that Snow-Ingram finally stood trial. The 10-year gap between the crime and the courtroom reflects both the complexity of the evidence-gathering process and, frankly, the way cases involving medical neglect and starvation can be harder to prosecute than cases of overt physical violence. The evidence is medical, expert-driven, and often fought vigorously by the defense. But in November of 2023, a Maricopa County jury found Denise Janelle Snow-Ingram guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse. On January 19, 2024, she was sentenced to 37 years in prison, 20 years for the murder conviction and 17 years for the child abuse conviction, to be served consecutively. She had already been in custody for 10 years by the time of sentencing, credit that would be applied to her murder sentence. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell said after the verdict that this was a child who stood no chance of surviving in the hands of her own parents, and that the prosecutors and victim advocates had defended the memory of an innocent child when almost no one else would. Miriam Ingram never made a sound that carried beyond the walls of the home that killed her. She never complained in a way that anyone outside her family heard. She was invisible, to the system, to the community, to the world, until the day she was carried out of her home on a stretcher weighing less than some people's newborn babies. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to run and play and eat and laugh. She deserved every birthday she never got. Denise Snow-Ingram will be in her 80s before she is released, if she lives that long. And Miriam Ingram, who never got to be a toddler, never got to take her first real steps, never got to see what the world outside her parents' home looked like, will never grow old at all. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Leave a comment for Miriam. She deserves to be remembered. Case 7. Retta Cruse, the mother who chose departure. There are crimes born of desperation. There are crimes born of mental illness. There are crimes born of a toxic combination of manipulation, dependency, and catastrophic failure of judgment. The case of Retta Cruse involves elements of all three, and it ends with 2 little girls lying side by side on a bed, their arms around each other, in the home where their mother had decided none of them should continue to live. Retta Cruse originally lived in Pleasantville, New Jersey, with her family, which included her partner Michael Coleman and her children. Among them were 2 daughters, 9-year-old Alea McIntyre and 4-year-old Royal McIntyre. Alea's biological father, Kevin Maddox, lived in Cumberland County, New Jersey, and had been engaged in a long and emotionally exhausting custody battle with Cruse for years. In August of 2019, a New Jersey Superior Court judge ruled that Cruse had been in violation of the existing custody agreement and ordered that Alea be returned to her father. The legal battle had, by Cruse's own admission at sentencing, drained her both financially and emotionally. She felt she was losing. She felt she had no path forward. And in this state of anguish, she and Michael Coleman, the biological father of 4-year-old Royal, arrived at a plan so horrific that investigators would later call it one of the most disturbing murder-suicides they had ever encountered. Coleman, by Cruse's account, had suggested that rather than lose their family to the courts, they would die together. All of them. They would commit a murder-suicide, take the lives of the girls, and then take their own lives, and depart this world as a family unit, intact, where no court could separate them. Coleman, according to Cruse, told her that he planned to communicate with them after death using a spirit box, a paranormal device purported to receive messages from the dead. Cruse said at sentencing that Coleman had pressured her repeatedly to follow through, insisting that there was no other path. No matter what option I tried, she told the court, Michael didn't see us prevailing. In September of 2021, the family had recently relocated from New Jersey to Arizona, ostensibly for spiritual reasons, according to a GoFundMe page set up by the family. On September 8, 2021, Retta Cruse administered a mixture of prescription oxycodone and over-the-counter acetaminophen, similar to Tylenol, to 9-year-old Alea and 4-year-old Royal, sedating them and then causing them to fatally overdose. When Michael Coleman arrived home that evening, he found blood on the walls and in the hallway. He went to the bedroom and found both girls dead on their beds, their arms around each other, as though they had fallen asleep embracing. Their father called 911. Police found Retta Cruse in another bedroom, having barricaded herself inside with a bed pushed against the door. She had stabbed herself in multiple places in an attempt to take her own life. Coleman, who had claimed he intended to follow through on the plan, had not done so. He was alive and denied involvement to investigators. Near the girls' bodies, police found a handwritten note bearing a signature very similar to Retta Cruse's. The note, which Cruse's attorney later confirmed was a suicide note, laid out her state of mind and her intentions. Retta Cruse was arrested and initially pleaded not guilty. She later changed her plea to guilty, accepting a deal that removed the death penalty from the table. And in August of 2022, she was sentenced by Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Margaret LaBianca to 2 consecutive natural life sentences in prison. At sentencing, Cruse wept. She told the court she remembered Alea as a mama's girl, active, outgoing, suffering from ADHD, full of life. She said she was confused about how she had woken up when the girls had not. And she said she still wanted to know if Coleman, with his spirit box, had ever been able to speak to the girls. The judge and prosecutors were unmoved. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell said that the very person who was supposed to care for these victims was the one who callously caused their deaths. Retta Cruse did not live to complete her sentence. On February 21, 2025, prison staff at the Arizona State Prison Complex Perryville in Goodyear found her unresponsive in her cell. She was pronounced dead. Investigators determined she had died by suicide, having hung herself. Alea McIntyre was 9 years old. Royal McIntyre was 4. They were found holding each other. They were not supposed to die. No court order should have ended in their deaths. No custody battle should have cost 2 little girls their lives. If these 2 girls' story breaks your heart as it breaks ours, please give this video a like, leave a comment, and make sure you are subscribed to Cold Case Revisited. We will continue telling their story as long as we have a voice. Case 8. Esther Callejas. She said she wanted them in heaven. On the morning of September 27, 2021, in a house near South 8th Place and Broadway Road in South Phoenix, a 24-year-old woman named Esther Callejas loaded a .38 special revolver she had purchased years earlier and hidden from her husband. She loaded it with 6 bullets. She told her children she wanted them to go to heaven. Then she shot them. This case is unlike many others in this documentary in that there was no prolonged history of abuse, no cult belief system, no months-long pattern of neglect or cruelty. By all outward appearances, Esther Callejas was a devoted mother. Her neighbors described her as a loving parent who played with her kids in the front yard. Her husband, Emmanuel Isidro, was a hard-working man. The family appeared, to the world around them, as happy. But Esther Callejas had been struggling. She had been prescribed antidepressants after telling her family she was depressed. Weeks before the shooting, Emmanuel had been worried enough about his wife and children that he had called the Phoenix Police Department for a welfare check. Officers responded to the home, but Esther and the children were not there. They checked a family member's home, also not there. Officers finally reached Esther by phone, and she told them everything was fine. The welfare check was closed. 14 days later, Esther Callejas picked up the gun. According to the probable cause statement and police account of the morning's events, Esther was in the bedroom when she fired the gun once, but accidentally shot herself in the hand. 6-year-old Emmanuel Jr. ran toward the door, trying to escape. Esther shot him. She then turned the gun on 2-year-old Esperanza, her baby daughter, named after Hope, and fired into her chest at close range. She shot her son 3 times, once in the head, once in the arm, once in the torso. She shot her daughter twice. Then, unable to reload the revolver because of her injured hand, Esther Callejas swallowed what remained of her prescription medication in an attempt to take her own life. She did not call 911. Her 6-year-old son was still alive and crying. She did not call for help. Instead, she called her husband. She called her sister-in-law. She told them she had just killed the kids. Emmanuel and his sister immediately called 911. Officers arrived and found all 3, Esther and both children, on the floor with gunshot wounds. They performed immediate life-saving measures. Both children were rushed to the hospital. 2-year-old Esperanza Isidro was pronounced dead. 6-year-old Emmanuel Jr. survived, though with severe injuries. When an officer at the hospital heard Esther Callejas speak, she was overheard saying, "I was supposed to protect my kids. I did the opposite and shot them." Police described the scene as among the worst any of them had experienced. Sergeant and Justice, speaking at a press conference, expressed what multiple officers felt. It is not normal to see a child shot. It is not normal to do CPR on a baby who was shot by a parent. During a police interview the following day, Esther Callejas admitted to shooting both children. She said she wanted them to go to heaven. She said she had planned to kill herself afterward, but was unable to reload the gun. At the time of this documentary's production, Esther Callejas faces charges of first-degree murder in the death of Esperanza Isidro and attempted first-degree murder for the shooting of Emmanuel Jr. She was booked into the Maricopa County Jail on a $2 million bond. Her case is ongoing in the Arizona court system. What makes this case particularly difficult to comprehend is the question that hangs over it. What breaks inside a person to such a degree that they would turn a gun on their own children? What happens to a mind under the weight of untreated mental illness, isolation, and depression that makes the unthinkable feel like mercy? There are no easy answers. But there is a child who is no longer here, and a little boy who will carry what happened to him forever. And there is a mother who must face the full weight of what she did. Esperanza. The name means hope. She was 2 years old. If you want to honor Esperanza and Emmanuel Jr., please like this video, leave them a comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. These are the stories that must not be forgotten. Case 9, Wendy Lavarnia, a gun on a bed. Not every case in this documentary involves premeditated murder in the traditional sense. Case 9 is the story of a death that resulted from recklessness so extreme, so flagrant, and so devastating that it led to the loss of a child's life, and a mother who, investigators believed, may have known far more about what happened than she ever admitted. On March 20, 2017, Phoenix police were called to a home near 35th Avenue and Cactus Road. A 9-year-old boy named Landon Lavarnia had been shot in the head. By the time emergency responders arrived, Landon was on life support. He died the following day. Wendy Lavarnia told police what happened. She had left her loaded handgun on the bed where her children were playing. She had turned away briefly to get a holster. And in that moment, she said, her 2-year-old son had picked up the weapon and accidentally shot his 9-year-old brother. It was a story that police immediately found troubling. Among the reasons for their skepticism, the lack of blood at the scene. Landon had been shot in the head. A wound of that nature would produce a significant amount of blood. When investigators conducted their forensic examination of the home, they found what appeared to be an extensive cleanup effort. Blood residue in multiple areas, including inside the family's car, but very little at the scene itself. The cleanup would have required substantial time, suggesting it occurred before Wendy called 911. Then there was the matter of the father, Kansas Lavarnia. He arrived at the home after police were already on scene, claiming he had been elsewhere when the shooting happened. But investigators noticed he had an unusual injury on his arm, what appeared to be a gunshot wound, crudely concealed beneath bandaging and tape, possibly punctured multiple times with a screwdriver to obscure its appearance. Kansas Lavarnia, speaking to the Arizona Republic shortly before his suicide in a prison cell, told a different version of the events. He said he had been at home during the shooting and had fled because he was a convicted felon prohibited from possessing firearms. He said the shot fired by the toddler had actually struck him first, in the upper left arm, causing the bullet to fragment, with one fragment then striking Landon in the head. Prosecutors were unable to definitively determine who fired the gun. The forensic evidence was complicated, the witnesses were the family members themselves, and the 2-year-old could not testify. What was established without dispute was that Wendy Lavarnia had left a loaded handgun within reach of her toddler children, a weapon she had, by her own admission, previously allowed her 2-year-old son to practice pulling the trigger of when it was empty. She had normalized a child's access to a weapon that had no safety mechanism, and she had not immediately sought medical care for Landon after he was shot, a failure that prosecutors called outrageous. The other 3 children in the home, removed by authorities after the shooting, were found to have drugs in their systems. Both Wendy and Kansas Lavarnia were initially charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors later reduced the charges against Wendy in a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and attempted child abuse. Kansas Lavarnia was also charged but died in prison before his case went to trial. On October 3, 2019, Wendy Lavarnia was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, the most lenient possible sentence under the terms of her plea agreement. The detective who investigated the case, Keith Moffat, addressed the court before sentencing and raised the well-being of the surviving children, saying the 2-year-old boy who had been in the room that day would now suffer a life of guilt and shame that was not his to bear. Wendy Lavarnia's sentence is notably different from the others in this documentary. She did not receive life in prison. She received 10.5 years. The question of whether justice was fully served in this case is one that many observers and child advocates have raised in the years since her sentencing. Landon Lavarnia was 9 years old. He was playing a video game when he was shot in the head. His toddler brother was in the room. His mother had placed a loaded gun on the bed. Some accidents are truly accidents, and some are the result of choices so irresponsible that the law has no other word for them but crime. Landon Lavarnia's death was the latter. We ask you to remember him by hitting the like button, subscribing to Cold Case Revisited, and leaving a comment for Landon. His name should be spoken. Case 10, Shawna Forde, the militia leader and the 9-year-old LD. We have saved the final case for a woman whose crime was not driven by postpartum depression, domestic instability, or the breakdown of a marriage. It was driven by ideology, by greed, by hatred, and by a willingness to walk into a family's home, look a 9-year-old girl in the face as she begged for her life, and pull the trigger anyway. Shawna Forde was born in 1967 and lived in Washington state. She had a criminal history dating back to her teenage years, repeated convictions for theft, burglary, and other offenses. But by 2007, she had reinvented herself as a border vigilante, joining and later founding a group called Minutemen American Defense, or MAD, a splinter organization from the Minuteman Civil Defense Corps, which had expelled her amid allegations of lying and unstable behavior. Forde was known as charismatic and grandiose. She described herself publicly as a border operations manager, bragging that her group would take border enforcement to the next level by directly targeting drug cartels operating near the Arizona-Mexico border. The Minuteman Civil Defense Corps' own founder, Chris Simcox, said publicly after Forde's arrest that her group was not just an unsavory group, but that Forde herself was pretty unbalanced. He had worried about the safety of others around her. The group was small, far smaller than Forde claimed, and it needed money. Shawna Forde's plan to raise those funds was as simple as it was monstrous. She and her associates, including Jason Eugene Bush, a man with ties to the white supremacist organization Aryan Nations, who served as Minutemen American Defense's National Director of Operations, identified a target: a family in Arivica, Arizona, a tiny desert community about 10 miles north of the Mexican border. The family was Raul Flores Jr., his wife Gina Gonzalez, and their children. Forde and her associates believed, or claimed to believe, that Raul Flores was involved in drug trafficking and that the home contained money and drugs that could be stolen to fund the group's activities. Investigators later determined the family was not a significant criminal operation. The expected haul of cash and narcotics largely did not materialize, but by then it was far too late. On the night of May 30th, 2009, Shawna Forde, Jason Bush, and a third accomplice named Albert Gaxiola approached the Flores home. They posed as law enforcement officers, telling the family they were officials looking for fugitives. Raul Flores Jr. opened the door. He was 29 years old. They shot him. Gina Gonzalez was shot as well, 3 times. With extraordinary presence of mind, she played dead. The intruders believed she was gone. They went through the house. They collected jewelry, including Gina's wedding ring, which was later found in Forde's possession. And then there was Brazenia, 9-year-old Brazenia Ileana Flores, a third-grade student at Sapori Elementary School in Amado, Arizona. A child with bright red fingernails and turquoise-colored pajama bottoms who, in the chaos of the home invasion, was somehow still alive and still standing. Brazenia Flores begged for her life. She was shot. In the head. Point blank. She was 9 years old. Gina Gonzalez, still alive and playing dead, heard it all. Once the intruders left, she retrieved her husband's handgun and exchanged fire with them when they returned, wounding Jason Bush in the leg. The killers then fled. Gina Gonzalez had survived, and she had the weapon, and she had her memory. Law enforcement tracked down Shawna Forde, Jason Bush, and Albert Gaxiola. The investigation drew on phone records, text messages, testimony from individuals who had cooperated with the FBI, and the devastating eyewitness account of Gina Gonzalez. Among the physical evidence, Gina's wedding ring, found on Forde. All 3 were arrested. All 3 were tried. All 3 were convicted. Shawna Forde's trial in Pima County was held in February of 2011. She was found guilty on all 8 counts for which she was prosecuted, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Raul and Brazenia Flores, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder for the shooting of Gina Gonzalez, and multiple counts of aggravated assault, burglary, and armed robbery. In the penalty phase that followed, the Pima County jury deliberated for 4 hours over 2 days. They sentenced Shawna Forde to death. Juror Angie Thomas later described how the jury arrived at that decision. She mentioned a photograph of Brazenia Flores that was presented during the trial. A picture of a little girl with bright red fingernails, wearing a white t-shirt and turquoise pajama bottoms, on a love seat. Thomas said it was a perfect, innocent picture until you realized that half of her face had been blown off. The juror said the jury chose death because that was what seemed fair. Because, as Thomas put it, while Shawna Forde got to delight in a photograph of her brand-new grandson, there was another person in this equation who never would. There was a little girl who would never wear her first pair of high heels, never have her first kiss, never go to prom or graduation. There was a little girl whose father would never walk her down the aisle. Shawna Forde remains on Arizona's death row as of the time of this documentary. Jason Bush was also sentenced to death. Albert Gaxiola received life in prison without parole. Gina Gonzalez, who survived being shot 3 times, who played dead with her husband's blood around her, who held herself together long enough to retrieve a weapon and fight back, faced prosecutors and told her story with extraordinary courage. She is the reason Shawna Forde was caught. Raul Flores Jr. was 29 years old and opened his door for people who told him they were the law. Brazenia Ileana Flores was 9 years old and begged for her life. Neither of them got it. Brazenia Flores was a 3rd grader. She had bright red fingernails. She had turquoise pajama bottoms. And she died in her own home at the hands of people who had decided, in their twisted calculus of ideology and greed, that her life was not worth preserving. If Brazenia's name moved you, if this entire documentary has moved you, please take a moment right now to hit the like button, leave a comment telling us which story struck you most deeply, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited so you never miss another episode. Brazenia deserves to be more than a case number. She deserves to be remembered. Every child in this documentary does. We began this documentary with a question, though we never spoke it aloud. How does a mother become a killer? Having walked through all 10 of these cases, through the doomsday ideology of Vallow Daybell, through the cold suffocation of Rachel Henry's 3 babies, through the Cleaver swinging in the dark in Inoue's Tempe apartment, through through the plastic box in the Phoenix summer heat, through the quiet starvation of baby Miriam and the deliberate overdose of Alea and Royal and the bullet that should never have been fired and the border vigilante who walked up to a little girl in turquoise pajamas and ended the world. Having walked through all of that, the question does not get easier to answer. Because the truth is, there is no single answer. These 10 women came from different backgrounds, different belief systems, different states of mind. Some were mentally ill. Some were driven by greed. Some were radicalized. Some were broken in ways the people around them failed to notice until it was too late. And at least one, Shawna Forde, appears to have been guided by nothing more than ideology, entitlement, and an absolute, chilling disregard for the lives of the people she targeted. What they have in common is this. There were children in their care who trusted them completely, who had no alternative, who had no other advocate. And every single one of those children was failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The Arizona court system, to its credit, has held each of these women accountable. Sentences ranging from 10.5 years to multiple consecutive life terms to the death penalty reflect the range of culpability and the range of crimes. Not everyone in this documentary received the sentence that victims' families and advocates believe they deserved. The system is imperfect, but the system moved, and for each of these children, at least, there is a record. There is a verdict. There is a name spoken in a courtroom. J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, Zane Henry, Maria Henry, Catalea Rios, Mia Inoue, Kai Inoue, Aim Deal, Miriam Ingram, Alea McIntyre, Royal McIntyre, Esperanza Isidro, Landon Lavarnia, Brazenia Flores, Raul Flores Jr. Say their names. Remember their names. Because the women who killed them will spend the rest of their lives in prisons and on death rows, fading, as one judge so powerfully put it, into obscurity. But the children they took from this world, those children deserved a life so full and so bright that no darkness should ever have found them. We at Cold Case Revisited believe in the power of true crime storytelling not because we sensationalize tragedy, but because we believe the dead deserve witnesses. We believe the stories of victims should outlast the infamy of those who killed them. We believe that in speaking these names, in telling these stories with accuracy and respect and full, unflinching honesty, we honor the people who can no longer speak for themselves. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of a documentary that was not easy to watch. Your presence here is an act of solidarity with every child who never made it out. If you haven't already, please hit that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm to show this story to more people, which means more witnesses for the victims whose names you just heard. Drop a comment below telling us which case affected you most. Your engagement matters. Your presence matters. And most importantly, please subscribe to Cold Case Revisited and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We do this work because children like Brazenia Flores, Aim Deal, and baby Catalea Rios deserve more than a footnote. They deserve a documentary. They deserve an audience. They deserve to be remembered forever. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. This has been Cold Case Revisited.